Hi and welcome to another episode of Delaware County Political News Meet the Candidate. I am your host, Larry DeMarco, and today we are here with Mary Gay Scanlan, candidate for the 5th Congressional District, Delaware County, South Philadelphia, and Montgomery County. As an attorney, school board member, and education advocate, Mary Gay Scanlan has been advocating for families, public education, and civil rights for the past 35 years. Resident of Delaware County, she has deep ties to the community with national and local experience. Mary Gay, thank you for being a guest on Delaware County Political News.
Thank you for having me.
Mary Gay, I understand that you have a lot of momentum behind your campaign.
It's been really an affirmation of the decision that I made to run, as I've gotten a great response. We had our kickoff a couple weeks ago, and I was really pleased to have support both from my hometown. We had about 60 people come out for that, but also from 3 of the 5 candidates who won the Delco countywide races last fall. Mary Walk, Joanne Phillips, and Jerry Saunders, Sheriff Jerry Saunders, came out and endorsed my candidacy. Joanne Phillips and I have worked together as lawyers for many years. Our children are friends. So she's familiar with my work as Pro-bono Counsel at a national law firm. Mary Walk is in the same community, and our children are friends. We came up together through home and school, and she's certainly familiar with my work on school board. And Sheriff Saunders is a strong advocate for criminal justice reform. So I was really thrilled that all 3 of them endorsed my candidacy. And Professor John Linder, the former mayor of Chester, also came out and spoke on my behalf. John and I have been friends for about 25 years now. He was the plaintiff in a class action in Chester seeking better services for students in that school district. And we've both worked on gun control in the years in between.
You have been an advocate for voting rights. Please discuss your work defending the right to vote.
Sure. Well, for the past 15 years, through my job as a pro bono coordinator for a national law firm, we've been involved in a number of voting rights projects, starting with, in 2006, coordinating testimony for Congress on reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. We sent a team of attorneys around the country to investigate and take testimony on what were still the barriers to voting in our country, and why was it necessary that the Voting Rights Act be authorized. Of course, it was reauthorized, but then the Supreme Court Shelby decision in 2012 came down and invalidated certain parts of that Voting Rights Act. And in the wake of that, we've seen a wave of legislation designed to suppress the vote. So we've been working again with national civil rights groups like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Brennan Center to investigate how the Shelby decision has restricted the right to vote and what kind of legislative fixes do we need to protect it again. Since January of 2017, I've been the co-chair of a national task force on voting rights, where we're trying to help the civil rights agencies that protect the right to vote in this country do their job better, because they have limited resources. And under the Trump administration, the U.S. Department of Justice has pulled back from protecting the right to vote. So we're working with these agencies on issues like strict voter ID laws, helping people who live in states where there are strict voter ID laws to get the ID they need to vote. And many people think this is a very simple thing, that it's easy to just get the ID you need. But if you are a poor person without access to transportation to get you to some kind of remote office where you have to get the ID, or if you were born at home, if you were born in another country, it can be very difficult to get the documentation you need to vote. So working on those kind of issues, working on gerrymandering, which of course everyone in Pennsylvania who follows our electoral process knows how deeply gerrymandering efforts by the right have affected the voters' ability to express themselves. Here in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court just threw out our congressional voting districts because they were so partisanly gerrymandered.
Mary Gay, you keep mentioning the word we. How big is the team? Are you talking about your law firm, and are there other people working together?
Sure. My law firm has been very active in election protection for decades, but certainly as long as I've been there, which is 14 years this year. We have people who do voter protection at the polls every year, and I've been doing that in Delco for over a decade now, making sure that people get to vote if they're eligible to vote. And there are a variety of ways, both through administrative inefficiency and through outright voter suppression tactics, that people may be denied the right to vote. So I've personally been involved in it. My firm has been involved in election protection, just mobilizing people to go out every election cycle. But then we've had these broader efforts that have been as part of a coalition of civil rights advocates and nonprofits around the country that are working to try to expand the rights of eligible voters, rather than allowing a situation to occur where people who have the right to vote have their vote suppressed.
You have also supported LGBT rights. Please discuss the work that you have done for their cause.
Sure. Well, that's for decades, I guess. I've been a supporter of the various organizations here in Philadelphia. The Bar Association first started an LGBT rights section, which then grew into a legal clinic for LGBT individuals to get legal assistance to address the variety of issues that they encounter, whether it's labor discrimination or until recently, same-sex marriage issues, the variety of ways in which our laws discriminate against or don't prevent discrimination against LGBT individuals. Most recently, I've been coordinating work in 4 different states on transgender name changes. So when people are in that process, if their appearance does not match their identity documents, it's an open invitation to discrimination every time they have to produce identity documents, whether it's renting a house or applying for student aid or being stopped, for a traffic ticket. So we've been involved in that. On a personal scale, I've been involved in it because my sister is gay and suffered discrimination both in the Army during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era, and as someone seeking same-sex marriage. She was married first in Canada because they legalized same-sex marriage before the U.S. did.
Mary Gay, before we continue, what is your work with your law firm?
So I'm pro bono counsel at a national law firm. We have 650 attorneys in 15 cities around the country, but the main office is in Philadelphia. As pro bono counsel, my job is to coordinate the free legal services that are donated by all of those attorneys with national nonprofits, legal services agencies, civil rights organizations, and other nonprofits around the country. So it's making sure that we have good opportunities for people to do this kind of work, representing low-income families, advocating on behalf of civil rights, and then to push that work forward.
And you do important work with education. Please tell us about that.
Well, my background is in education. I spent a decade at the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania, which is a nonprofit that advocates for a quality public education for every student in the Commonwealth.
What have you done with the Chester Upland School District?
When I joined the Education Law Center, it had just filed a lawsuit with Legal Aid of Delaware County on behalf of families and children in the Chester Upland School District who were in special education but were not receiving the federally mandated services to which they were entitled. So the purpose of that lawsuit was to direct more resources to that school district so that kids could get the education that they were entitled to. At the time, the school district was really sort of a patronage mill for the Republican Party out in Delaware County. A lot of relatives of GOP officials on the payroll, a lot of inefficiencies, and kids with disabilities were not receiving services. They were getting shunted into an ineffective special ed system. So the state is responsible for ensuring that children with disabilities receive the appropriate education to which they're entitled, and the state was not doing that. So we sued the state and the school district because the district actually has to deliver it. We entered into a series of consent decrees over time, trying to improve that system. The state violated those consent decrees, so we had the state held in contempt. And we made some progress there. We were able to ferret out some of the corruption and the wasted spending. But it was a really difficult situation because it's hard for courts to improve education. In the end, the charter school movement came in, and there was pressure to transfer a lot of the district's funding to charter schools, which has not turned out so well. A lot of that money has been misspent. That would not have been the result we hoped for. But as I said again, it's difficult for courts to change educational systems.
Your work led to a statewide appointment. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I was at the Education Law Center for a decade, and I worked on the Chester Upland case. I worked on another case involving the complaint system for the entire state. Worked on drafting some legislation with respect to school-to-work transition for children with disabilities. So over time, I was appointed to a couple different statewide interagency commissions. One was to try to implement school-to-work transition in the state, and the other was one of the periodic commissions they have to appoint to try to assess whether special education in the state is being implemented properly. Where are the gaps? How can we plug those holes?
Mary Gay, you were a school board member of the Wallingford-Swarthmore School District, vice president, I believe?
And president.
And president, excuse me. Why is it important for someone running for federal office to get involved in local government at the grassroots level?
I think there's a couple reasons. I mean, one is it causes you to really think about what you're doing and why. There's a clarifying process in running for office when you have to really be sure of who you are and be able to project that to people, and also not to be sidetracked if you are the subject of mischaracterization, shall we say. I got into being on the school board because I had a deep understanding of education law. My kids were in the schools, and I wanted to have an impact. Through that process of running for office, I went door to door twice to every house in the district where I ran. Got to meet a lot of people, got to hear about their concerns, and then could be a resource for them when they had questions and issues about the public schools.
Sadly, school violence, to be specific, gun violence has now is a major concern in on the national level. What is your position on gun control? What can be done to keep our children safe?
Well, it's certainly not a recent event. I mean, it's a national shame that we haven't done a better job with addressing the issues of gun violence. In 2000, right after the Columbine shooting, there was a movement called the Million Mom March, and a lot of people organized to go to DC to march to make that the last incident.
You were involved in that, I understand?
I was involved in that. I was so shocked. I had young children at the time that I signed up and started organizing 2 buses. Actually charged the buses to my personal credit card. Fortunately, there were a lot of people who wanted to go as well, but I organized about 90 people from the area where I live to go down to the Million Mom March, and then participated in follow-up activities with a local group, and then have been supportive of the variety of groups that have started to form as a counterweight to the NRA and trying to influence our federal legislators to enact common sense gun control laws. I'm not an anti-gun zealot. I am a lawyer. I understand there's the Second Amendment. My father, both grandfathers were hunters. Where I grew up, a lot of people depend upon hunting for food, to put food on the table. So I understand that there is a role for responsible gun ownership, but what we're talking about is not responsible gun ownership. And there's some fairly straightforward things we can do that the majority of people in this country support. So background checks, reinstating, it's not a new thing. The assault rifle ban, allowing the Center for Disease Control to actually conduct research on the causes of gun violence and what we can do to prevent it. It is not enough to say, oh, we don't know what to do, or oh, we just need to enforce the laws, if you're not going to actually do that. So it is time for people who take NRA money and support the NRA to back off, because the country is demanding more.
So right now, we are doing the absolute minimum to nothing.
There hasn't been gun control legislation passed in a couple decades now, nothing really effective. So yeah, we've been in a Stonewall situation. We didn't have reforms after Columbine, we didn't have reforms after Sandy Hook. I'm so grateful to the students from Parkland and their eloquence. I mean, it really feels like we could be entering a time somewhat like when I was growing up in the late 60s or early 70s, when young people really took to the streets and organized and pushed the country forward in terms of things like, 18-year-olds being able to vote. I hope every 18-year-old out there right now who is outraged about what is going on with respect to gun violence votes this year.
To switch to something a little lighter, you've represented some high-profile sports teams. Can you share what you did for them?
My law firm has been engaged for a long time in representing women athletes. So back in the 90s, we represented the U.S. women's soccer team in their fight for pay equity and conditions. You know, they had just won the World Cup and they were still traveling on buses and having to pay for their own child care and not having adequate training opportunities, while the men were not winning World Cups but were traveling by plane and getting paid much, much more. So the firm assisted the U.S. women's soccer team for pay equity and better conditions. And then just last year, in part because of that earlier representation, we had the opportunity to represent U.S. women's hockey. And they struck for better conditions and in fact were able to obtain them and just won the gold medal.
Yes, they did. Congratulations to your client. I understand that you do pro bono immigration work. Can you explain what you do and why there's such a burning need for that?
So the work that our office is focused on and that I have focused on is people who are coming to this country fleeing political and economic oppression and really just seeking a life or a better life. And these are, by and large, these are people who have grit and integrity, and they come here and they are hardworking, law-abiding citizens. So it has been a pleasure to represent them. For the past 5 years, my husband and I have jointly represented a woman, Hawa Salah, who's a human rights activist from Darfur. In Darfur, she was kidnapped multiple times, she was shot, she was jailed for months at a time, and she was tortured because she was standing up for the rights of her people. She was assisting refugees, and particularly female refugees in Darfur. And for her trouble, she was subject to just unbelievable abuse. So as a result of U.S. pressure, she was released from jail but had to flee Darfur or she would have been executed. So she came to this country. She now works in our law firm. She has received asylum. She is looking forward to becoming a citizen this year, and she's one of the hardest working people I've ever met. She goes to her day job all day, and she advocates for her people weekends. Sometimes she has to take a day off from work. She had to go testify before the UN Security Council a couple years ago. She occasionally protests outside the UN or attends conferences on the human rights situation in Darfur. So, having those kind of people in our country makes us stronger.
I understand the travel ban had relevance to this work too.
Yes, when the travel ban went into effect in January 2017, of course, we're all familiar with the chaos that erupted at the airports as people with legal documentation were arriving in the U.S. and being turned away. So part of my job is to organize pro bono counsel around the country. We were organizing people to go to the airports and represent people at the airports as they were trying to enter the country. So we had people at JFK, we had people in Atlanta who participated in a sit-in with Congressman Lewis when they couldn't get access to the immigrants. We had people in Orlando. And we had people standing by available to help people who couldn't get into the country, although they had documentation to do so. And I mentioned previously that Hawa Salah is a Darfur human rights activist who we have assisted to obtain asylum here. She would not have been allowed into this country under that travel ban because she's from Sudan. And here she is, a human rights activist who has been lauded around the world, and she wouldn't have been able to get into the country. So there's been a lot of attention that was paid to the travel ban and the protests at the airports, but there was an equally insidious executive order that came down at the same time, and that was the one that upended the priorities for the Customs and Border Patrol and the immigration authorities on who they were going to deport. So under the Obama administration, the focus was upon violent criminals, career offenders. The Trump administration has switched that and said anyone who has any kind of legal violation. So now people who, may have been in the country since they were a child, who've been here, paying taxes, working hard, if they get a traffic ticket or some kind of minor violation, they can be detained and subject to deportation. There's certainly been story after story in the news over the past few months. So one of the immediate effects of this change in priorities for deportation was to pick up people who have been living here with the government's knowledge, checking in regularly while their cases work their way through our system. Suddenly, those people were no longer safe. Their families were no longer safe. Many of them have married Americans, they have children who are Americans, and they are terrified. So we started working with agencies around the country that work with immigrants. They were getting, their phones were ringing off the hooks, with the big question being, how do I protect my children if I'm deported? So we worked with a group called Appleseed and prepared a manual that is literally entitled How to Protect Your Children and Your Assets in Case You're Deported. Because there are things that people can do, it varies by state, but you can, in some states, you can designate a standby guardian. So if your children are at school and you go to work and you're picked up in an immigration sweep at work, what happens to your children? The children are terrified, the immigrants are terrified. So there are things that can be done to help plan for that if necessary. So we worked on that project, and then we've worked on pushing it out in a variety of states and doing training for advocates around the country who are working for these blended families. It's not just the illegal immigrant, it's the impact on their community, on their children, and their spouses.
You also believe that there's a need for criminal justice reform. Please discuss that.
Sure. A lot of our mandatory sentencing laws have really had a disparate impact, particularly on low-income communities. And there's been a book written about it in Philadelphia about the disruption to our communities because of mass incarceration. Certainly, the percentage of Americans who are incarcerated has just skyrocketed since the 1990s, and it's had a particularly bad impact on cities like Philadelphia. We've participated in a number of initiatives involving criminal justice reform. So one of them was the Clemency Initiative, which President Obama's administration spearheaded. This was an initiative to target people who were nonviolent federal offenders, because it had to involve the federal government, who had been in jail for more than 10 years but would not have gotten a sentence of the duration they did if they were sentenced today. Both sides of the political spectrum have come to see that mandatory sentencing laws have a bad impact. They have a bad impact on the individual subject to them if they were not in need of that duration of punishment, and on their relatives and on their families. And it has a bad bad impact on our economy. It's incredibly expensive to warehouse people in the percentages and in the way that we have been doing it. So the right has been looking at ending mass incarceration because of the adverse economic impact, and the left has been in favor of the same proposals because of the human rights impact. So we worked with the Clemency Project to represent over 100 individuals who were eligible for that project. We got presidential clemency grants for 29 people, and those people have been able to restart their lives. Some of them had been given life sentences for relatively minor drug offenses, nonviolent drug offenses. And just working with those people has been really life-affirming. I've met with a couple of the people who received presidential clemency, and they are just dedicated to making the most of the second chance that they received. Other areas where there's a lot of room for work is expungement. Again, old convictions or arrests that never went to conviction. A lot of our states have seen that we can do better in this arena, and we need to clear some of these old violations or minor violations so that people can get a job, so that the chances of them becoming recidivists and going back to jail can be reduced, which they can't be reduced if the person can't get a job because of the record they have and it's not relevant to a current job. We've also worked with a number of courts that have reentry programs for people who are leaving incarceration and helping them get back on their feet, helping them overcome the seemingly minor legal battles that can keep them from getting a job, like not having a driver's license because they lost it while they were in jail. So there's a lot of work that can be done to help people coming out of jail re-enter society, get a job, and be productive members of society.
Mary Gay, what got you interested in running for Congress?
Well, two things really happened in quite rapid succession in January of 2018. The first was that the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court threw out the gerrymandered congressional districts, which had been in place in Pennsylvania since 2011. I've lived in the same house in Delaware County for 24 years, and during that time I've been in 3 different congressional districts. When I moved in, I was in the 7th, which was the traditional Delaware County district. And then I got gerrymandered into the 1st district, so really an appendage of Philadelphia. And now, under the new lines drawn just in February of this year, I'm back in the 5th, which is a more compact district and seems a little more fairly drawn because it's going to allow representation of the people who actually live in proximity to each other.
Which, of course, was the old 7th.
The old 7th, yes. So being an advocate for election protection and election fairness, I of course was very focused on the redistricting, and it had a huge impact on our community, on the Delaware County community and those that are aligned with it. Instead of having a very safe Republican district with an incumbent who had a $2 million campaign war chest, all of a sudden there was the opportunity for someone to be elected who might more fairly represent the community who lives across the broader region. The second thing was that the day following the redistricting decision from the Supreme Court was when we learned that Congressman Meehan, who'd held the seat based in Delaware County, had been accused of sexually harassing a much younger staffer and then using taxpayer funds to pay the claim she made against him. As a woman who's been in the workforce for 40 some odd years, like probably almost every other woman during that time period, I have experienced sexual harassment. My daughter graduated from college 3 years ago, and she has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. So it is something that we need to stop, and having that instance in conjunction with the voting rights issues, really, I'd had enough. Okay, so I have been working over the past few years to elect more women to state level positions. Pennsylvania has a terrible record of electing women. Right now we have a congressional delegation that has 20 people in it. It has 2 male senators and 18 male congressmen. There are no women in a 20-person congressional delegation. So I started looking for the woman I was going to support to run for the new congressional district. I didn't see someone who had the length and depth of experience in Delaware County, and that's when people started asking me if I was running, and I started to consider it.
Why should people vote for you?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I'm a long-term resident of Delaware County and the Delaware Valley. I've been in the Philadelphia area since 1981. I've worked professionally on public interest issues and community service issues that entire time, so I have a lot of connections throughout the region. I'm familiar with a lot of the issues in Philadelphia that then bleed over into the suburbs, but I've also lived in a suburban area and served on our local school board. I think the experience of having run for office and served in public office is valuable. Obviously, Congress is a lot different. It's like public office on steroids. But I do think having that experience, but not being a career politician, is probably what people are looking for right now. People are not looking for the same old players to be running for yet another office. I think they are looking for some fresh ideas. I think they're looking for some outside experience, and I think they're looking for people who know how to get things done. And that's been the focus of my entire career: seeing a problem, researching, what are the options, and then getting something done. What I do in my current job is bringing people together to solve problems. Through legal means usually, sometimes through other forms of advocacy. One of the things that worked the best on the U.S. women's soccer strike was the amount of social media and other kind of press support that the team working on that case were able to drive to support the women, so that the U.S. Hockey Federation was not able to recruit scabs. They weren't able to turn it into the women were somehow misbehaving. In fact, the women got support from all the other professional players' leagues. So looking for unusual situations, bringing people together to get things done, and not being about some kind of zero-sum game where everybody stands in their separate corners looking for a win, but it doesn't advance the ball for the country.
Mary Gay, we're going to leave it there, but I want to thank you for being a guest on Delaware County Political News.
Thank you for having me.
We have been here with Mary Gay Scanlan, and I am your host, Larry DeMarco. If you like this video, please share it, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We are signing off. Tune in next time. Bye for now.